Stratford, ONT, a suddenly animated bust of Coriolanus begins speaking on the stage of the Avon Theatre, startling the audience into awkward titters of surprise. It's the first clue that this production of the violent Shakespearean tragedy of a Roman ruler struck down by pride won't be much like any other, but that much you'd have known before the curtain went up. After all, it's directed by Quebec City-based master of theatre craft Robert Lepage, who never does anything by the book. The faster you rise, the harder you fall. Lepage's Coriolanus, opening Friday at the Stratford Festival, is shot through with wildly original technique, a hallway of offices that reveal themselves as actors track slowly from one side of the stage to the next, or a scene between a pair of soldiers that occurs entirely in text messages, projected full-size on a screen. Throughout, a remarkably fluid mechanical four-part frame moves and shifts in real time to focus the audience towards the action, whether broadly or close-up. It's as close to a movie experience as the stage will ever get, and for Lepage that's the point. It's a very cinematic play. There's something about the "meanwhile back at the ranch" type of thing that it employs that made it really interesting to me, so I wanted to work with that, said Lepage, 60, on a recent visit to Toronto. Article continued below. It puts us more in control of what the audience sees, which is completely counter to Elizabethan staging, where you're meant to show them the whole world. But at the same time, the audience's narrative vocabulary has evolved. 50, even 30 years ago, people had a way of understanding storytelling, but that's all exploded. Jump cuts, flash forwards. People have an education now of what storytelling is. It's not conscious, but it's there in a way it wasn't 30 years ago. So the idea is to try to create a vocabulary on stage where people can participate. Lepage, of course, has been experimenting with theatrical vocabulary for the better part of 30 years, crafting an international reputation for his dazzlingly original stagecraft. At one point in our conversation, he talks about the idea of strobing, the phenomenon of the unconscious mind solving problems while in flight mode, a throwback to the days when our ancestors would be running through the forest for their lives, letting autopilot guide them to safety. Its source: Neil Young and Peter Gabriel, for whom he has designed the staging for their respective world tours. I don't want to name drop, he shrugs, explaining how strobing has become a core ethos of his practice. When they get stuck on a song, Neil gets on his horse and gallops into the forest, Peter drives his sports car through the English countryside. And it just comes to them. Coriolanus doesn't emerge on horseback, but in Lepage's telling, he does escape Rome in a sleek silver sports car, and the show is the product of very much the same process, shaped by 2 years of on-again, off-again thinking. You have a set idea, a design idea, a character idea. It's important to have time and space to play with that, Lepage says. Then you come back 6 months later and whatever really worked or was important will emerge. Emilio Vieira, left, and Farhang Daher as soldiers, communicating entirely by text message. In Coriolanus, David Hu, Stratford Festival. Andre Sills as Coriolanus in an innovative production premiering June 22 at the Stratford Festival. David Hu, Stratford Festival. Robert Lepage says modern audiences have new ways of understanding narratives, and he wants his telling of Coriolanus to reflect that. It's a very cinematic play, he says. Renee Johnston, Toronto Star. 6 months may sound like a stretch, but consider, in all his long and decorated career, Lepage has rarely worked with the big dogs of English-Canadian performing arts. This spring, he's doing a run with all of them at once: the Canadian Opera Company, which remounted his work The Nightingale in April, the National Ballet of Canada, for which he co-produced Frame by Frame, which premiered earlier this month, and this week, of course, Stratford. That's partly by choice. The way they work and the way I work are very different things. He laughed, but it's also been an issue of timing. This spring, things converged. "We'd been wanting to do something for ages," he says, matter-of-factly. "Finally, we were able to make it work," article continued below. Strobing, then, has been as much a practicality as a philosophy, as performers shuttled between Toronto and Quebec City, where Lepage's production company Ex Machina is based. Working simultaneously on each put the company to the test, and it passed spectacularly. Both the Nightingale and Frame by Frame were aesthetic triumphs, with the bracing reimagining of Coriolanus looking much the same. Indeed, in Lepage's hands, the typically linear staging of the play becomes a scenic collage, jumping nimbly from one situation to the next, though stagecraft was far from his sole concern. While the staging is brisk and fluid, Lepage also wanted to shift the story to a contemporary context. In the play, Coriolanus, a celebrated warrior from the ruling patrician class, looks to turn his success on the battlefield into a turn as the Roman ruler. Read more. Translating film to the stage is a delicate dance for Robert Lepage and Guillaume Couta. Magic is possible in Lepage's masterful 887. The complications of politics prove to be ill-fitting for a warrior used to a black and white world, and things get ugly quickly. In the story, Lepage started to see some stark contemporary parallels that made his approach to stagecraft less central than the narrative itself, but it's not the parallel you're probably thinking. Typically with Coriolanus, you take the side of the people, he says, the ruler-to-be's hubris in assuming that power will simply fall to him being the crux of the drama. Cast out, he joins Rome's mortal enemies and prepares to lead a force against it. Instead, Lepage started to see a different point of view. With the social media phenomenon, where people's opinions inform so much of what we do with our lives, where the number of likes decides what we should program, I cringe, he says. And my discourse against that is exactly what Coriolanus says in 3/4 of the play. He's a spoiled brat born to the ruling patricians, and he doesn't like the fact that the laymen, the common folk, have their say on society. 20 years ago, yes, of course, you could hate Coriolanus for that. But when you read it today in the context of social media, which is a tool for ignorance, I think we have a different view. Given that social media and politics, and, frequently, ignorance, most often converge on the Twitter feed of Donald Trump, Lepage's Coriolanus has a sudden urgency, though he demurs. The thing that's interesting about Trump is that when you read Coriolanus, you'd be tempted to draw parallels. But I don't do that, he said. The extraordinary context of Coriolanus is that it's the first republic, it's the first attempt to create a society not ruled by a monarch. It changes the whole system, and you see how the establishment reacts to that, how they have disdain but play along. And you recognize, this is the whole American Republican system. We allude to that, what are the rules, and how does democracy survive in that? A better question, maybe, given its current convulsions, is whether it should. Is not a system better than another, he says slyly. There are some people better than others. I'm not anti-democracy, but there's no real system yet that has proven itself to be the right one. Coriolanus runs at the Stratford Festival until October 20. For more information, please see stratfordfestival.ca. Murray White is the Star's art critic, based in Toronto. Follow him on Twitter, @UntitledToronto.